Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching on YouTube or on Rumble. I'm very excited about today's stream because as the Ukraine conflict renewed geopolitical rivalry between major world powers, we will discuss today in this stream with Dr. Jamal Wakim the implications of this geopolitical conflict on Europe and Russia. We will also discuss the political or the potential all-out war between Hezbollah and Israel. As you may know, Dr. Jamal Wakim is from Lebanon. He's based there. He's a professor of history and international relations and the author of several books, most importantly, at least for me, The Struggle of Power Over Syria. This book is very important for you guys as well if you want to understand the historical context of why Syria is important from the historical, civilizational, and geopolitical context. When you read this book, you understand why there is also a struggle of power over Syria today. The links for his book, if you want to purchase it from the United States or from Germany, are in the description below. Dr. Jamal Wakim, thank you so much for being with me today in this live streaming.
Thank you for inviting me to this live streaming, and it's an honor to be with you on Syriana Analysis.
Guys, if you don't know, Dr. Jamal Wakim was my former boss in Lebanon, as I used to be an anchor and a producer in Beirut in one of the TV channels. And during our discussions on a tea time or on a coffee, I learned a lot about geopolitics as he is expert. And today I saw a photo of him with Pepe Escobar, and I sent him an email and I said, "Hey, Pepe, you know that Jamal Wakim was my former boss, and I learned a lot from the current geopolitical issues from him. I think it's important also to see people like Jamal and Pepe are gathering together in our modern times, as we need people to fill the vacuum, the intellectual vacuum that unfortunately speaking, many of the Western societies have left because the intellectuals aren't really handling the important issues. Now, in 2014, as I was in his office when the coup happened in Kiev back then, Dr. Jamal told me that if World War III is going to erupt, it's going to be in Ukraine. The World War didn't erupt yet, but we are one step away, or one miscalculation away, or one provocation away from a major outbreak of war between Russia and the NATO countries. Dr. Wakim, it's important to also tell the people the personal side. How do you analyze, for example, as an international relations and as an expert in international relations and geopolitics, how can someone read such major events, for example, when it happened in 2014, a coup in Kiev, and foresee the future? Back then, thanks to your warning, I started to dig into the Ukrainian conflict to learn why Ukraine is important.
Well, actually, it started, for me, it started by intuition, based on precedents, actually. When you go back in history and you see a recurrent or event, or let's say events that are or reactions or actions by some decision makers that are similar one to another despite the difference of time. And then I started to acquire this methodology, become, let's say, aware of this methodology. And it's not, I would say, enigmatic. It's not a secret. Well, when you read, for example, someone like Fernand Braudel, with his approach to different times in history, he says that history is divided, or times of history are divided into three categories. The one that is what he calls the short history, which is related to the actions of certain individuals, leaders, certain elites, etc. So he says that this is the short history because it's related to the actions of a certain individual or some individuals whose lifespan, or let's say as rulers, as commanders, etc., wouldn't exceed a generation, 30 years, for example.
Yes.
Whereas when he talks about the middle range history, or he analyzes history based on socioeconomic factors, and we see that the changes in socioeconomic relations takes much wider or takes more time than the actions of certain individuals.
Mhm.
Whereas when he talks about the let's say history based on geography or geographical history, he talks about the long-term history, or when you can write history on a long term, including several hundred years or sometimes millenniums. And he says about this that this is what he calls the fixed time of history,
Mm.
because we see recurrent actions, the same reaction, for example, by certain rulers with regards to, or let's say, a certain pattern of action based on their approach of accessing or managing the territory. So, for example, if we take Egypt, for example, Egypt is the oldest political entity in the world, and that has been fixed, almost fixed in its, let's say, borders since antiquity. And it all revolves around defending the delta of the Nile, as it's the main source of income, for example. So we see that the defense of the Nile or the delta mainly relies on securing the water resources of Egypt.
Mhm.
So we need to go to the waterfalls of the Nile, whether in the Victoria Lake or in Ethiopia, for example.
Mhm. Yeah.
And at the same time, we see that the line of defense for the delta goes deep in North Africa. At a lower extent, it would be in Benghazi, in eastern Libya, and at farther extent, it would go all the way to Tunisia. Whereas, with regards to defending Egypt from the east, the major defensive line is that of Gaza Bir Saba line. Okay,
Mhm.
so we see, for example, that it was on this line that the Mamluks in 1260 fought the Mongols and let's say prevented them from entering into Egypt, and almost 700 years later, we saw Jamal Abdel Nasser fighting the Zionists along this line in Fallujah, for example.
Mhm.
If we
Mhm.
go even in history back to the days of Thutmose III, we see that this line was set back then in order to ward off the incursions of the Hyksos after the tribes coming from the east after Egypt freed itself from their rule, for example. So
Yes.
this is how you can. Sorry.
Yeah. So you have
Hello.
to go back.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I can hear you. I can hear you, Dr. Jamal.
I have problems, connection problems. Sorry for that. You know,
No
this is
worries.
Lebanon after all. So,
Mhm.
with regards to Ukraine, for example, in this case, you need to be, let's say, hello,
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you.
hello. Yeah. So in this case, you need to be deeply indulged in history, know the history of this of a certain region in details on a long term, for example, and try to see similarities in the course of action of each and every ruler. With regards to Ukraine, for example, first you need to read what Brzezinski says about Ukraine and how it is important for Russia. Uh, he bluntly says that Russia without Ukraine, it would no longer be a Eurasian power, but it would become blocked inside Asia.
Yes.
And if you go back in history, you see that not only the Americans tried to get to Russia through Ukraine, but also the Nazis back in 1941. The main thrust was through Ukraine. And for example, Adolf Hitler learned the lesson from Napoleon when he quarreled with his generals and said, Moscow is not of any strategic importance, that we need to go to Stalingrad. And if we get there, we will be able to split European Russia from Asian Russia. And actually, Karl Haushofer back then talked about dividing Russia into several states. And this was also the case of Napoleon Bonaparte. This was also the case with the Teutonic Knights in the 13th century when they fought against Alexander Nevsky. And even this tactic or strategy of scorched earth that was used by the Russians over and over again during all their conflicts with Western powers, we see a precedence for that in the book of Herodotus, the father of history, when he talked about the invasion of Darius, the Persian king or Persian emperor, to Thrace, and then Darius tried to block the line of commerce of the Greek states coming from the Black Sea by trying to invade what is now southern Russia. And Herodotus actually talked about this scorched earth tactic used by the tribes living in that land back then, when they started to withdraw before the enemy in order to extend his lines of communication and then involve him in a war of attrition that got Darius' army exhausted. So we see this event repeating itself with Napoleon, with even before Napoleon, Karl XII of Sweden, and of course Adolf Hitler. And we see also that all battles, or let's say decisive battles that were won by the Russians were won actually either in Ukraine or nearby Ukraine. For example, the Battle of Poltava in 1709 against Karl XII. So after 10 years of continuous defeats at the hands of the Swedes, the Russians were able to turn the tide in Poltava in 1709, and thereafter they were able to win the War of the North. Same happened with Kursk battle in July 1943, for example, which was somewhere near Ukraine now. So this is how you can draw, let's say, conclusions. And in this case, when you have this recurrent, let's say, pattern, you can foretell or predict what would be the reaction of a certain decision maker in case he threatened in this area or that area. And by the way, that was also true about the integral relationship between Serbia and Russia, for example. Russia entered the First World War because of the Austrian invasion of Serbia back then. Later on in 1943, 1941, the main point of conflict between Stalin and Hitler was mainly the Russian influence or Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, and this integral relationship between Serbia or Yugoslavia back then and Russia. And thereafter, in 1999, Yeltsin made this big mistake by letting go of his ally Milosevic. And that was the reason why there was a sort of coup in the palace, because all of a sudden, 6 weeks later, after the NATO strike against Serbia, of course, Yeltsin was implicated in this. He gave the green light for that. And that was when the deep state in Russia rebelled and brought to the office of Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, who a few weeks later became the president of the Russian Republic.
And the rest is history, right? I mean, today, when you speak about the attempt, when you spoke about this historical context of the importance of Ukraine and the attempts to separate Russia from Europe in order, not from Europe, but from the more Western depth of Europe, let's say, in order to keep Russia more an Asian power and not to become a Eurasian power, for example. And but today in 2024, when I see what's happening in Ukraine, I mean, you already said that one of the goals was to draw this line, right, to separate Russia from Europe.
Yeah.
And when I see this, hasn't the United States succeeded and managed to do that? I mean, Russia is alienated now from Europe, and most of the European countries are hostile towards Russia, and they are increasingly becoming more anti-Russian, especially Germany, Poland, the Baltic countries. More countries are joining NATO. So when we speak about the successes of Russia in Ukraine in terms of the ground military achievements against the Ukrainian forces, but at the same time, on a geopolitical, from a geopolitical point of view, the United States also managed to succeeded to bring all the European continent mostly against Russia, right? So now Russia is separated from Europe. I think we lost. Did you hear me, Dr. Jamal? Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
I think I got your point, despite this.
So this is what happens, guys, when you live sometimes in places like Lebanon or in Syria. The connection and the internet gets disrupted, and especially when you are in a place that the internet connection is really, really not good. And unfortunately, I lived in Lebanon for quite some time. It's really, really pain in the, I don't want to say the entire thing, but it's really difficult to secure a good internet connection. Yeah, he's back. Let me check if I can unmute him. His voice is just a sec. Yeah. Let me see. I can't unmute him now, unfortunately. And you have muted yourself. I think you have to unmute yourself, Dr. Wakim. Yeah, it works now. I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hello? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no
Hello?
worries. I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you.
Well, I think that this is a better connection because now I'm branched to my phone, 3G.
Yeah.
Hope it works better. Okay.
Better.
Well, based on my understanding of European geopolitics, which actually Western Europe considers itself as a continuation of or a reincarnation of the Roman Empire. Okay, and this Roman Empire was mainly threatened or had a problem in drawing its borders to the east. Okay, so if we see the map, even when it was ruling North Africa, the desert played the role of it, or let's say, was its southern borders and separated it from Africa. Okay, in the east, for example, the Euphrates played a major role in drawing the borders of the Roman Empire in the east. Okay, in the north, of course, we had the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, whereas the Roman Empire had a major problem in drawing its eastern borders, so especially in Europe. So during the days of Julius Caesar, he was able to draw the line along the Rhine River and the Danube River. Okay, and back then the Germans were considered as aliens. Okay, and then the western part of the Roman Empire collapsed due to the incursions by Germanic tribes coming from the Eurasian plains. Okay, so this posed a problem, especially with the rise of Europe after the 16th century. There was this problem of drawing the borders of Europe in the east. So the Pope, actually, or the papacy, played a major role in rejuvenating the Western realm, especially starting from the 11th century onward. But this time it was mainly ideological. Religion played the major role. In order to create a sort of a common sense or common identity between various people. We have more than 40 major languages in Europe. So Greek Catholicism became the major unifying force during the late Middle Ages. And for this reason, they had to create an enemy. Okay? So this enemy, because it will solidify and strengthen this common tie among the various people of Europe, unified by Catholicism. Okay, so that was one of the reasons for the Crusades against Islam, and not only that, but also against Eastern Christianity. Okay, because for them, let's say Western Europe, they had a problem in drawing the borders of Europe in the east. The Mediterranean separated them from the
I think we are again facing a problem with Dr. Wakim's connection. I apologize from you guys for this inconvenience.
Arabs and Muslims. The Atlantic Ocean drew the borders of
I think he is speaking to himself now because he doesn't know that his connection is poor. I will just try to take him out and back to... Yeah, Dr. Wakim.
I don't know what to do with the connection. I'm alternating between Wi-Fi and 3G. Right. So they had a problem, especially in drawing their borders in the east. So that's why the Crusades weren't only directed against the Muslims, but were also directed against Eastern Christians.
Yes.
The Fourth Crusade actually sacked Constantinople rather than go to Jerusalem and fight the Saracens, for example. And at the same time, this was how Poland was converted to Catholicism, and other countries in Eastern Europe. So that the Crusades were also directed against the Orthodox, for example. And for the Russians, especially with Alexander Nevsky, the Russians who adopted Orthodox Christianity back in the 10th century, which became an integral part of their national identity. So Alexander Nevsky didn't have a problem with the Mongols who were ruling in the east and who converted to Islam starting from the late 13th century onward, but had a big problem with the Teutonic Knights based in Eastern Prussia and other Baltic states. So this was due to the ideological religious factor that played an integral role in creating what we call Western Europe.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, Protestantism is despite all this theological conflict with Catholicism, but it is an offspring of Western Christianity after all. Okay, so this sets the fundamental basics for the geopolitical hostility of Western Europe towards Russia. So Russia, until Peter the Great, was considered as a backward country, and thereafter it became as an evil necessity in order to establish order in this backward Eastern European region. And later on, with Metternich, after the collapse of Napoleon, let's say, rule of Europe, Russia was granted the dirty role, quote unquote, of keeping at bay the Eastern Europeans in order to leave this Western Europe, let's say, enjoy its wealth, its prosperity, and its conquest of the rest of the world. So later on, for example, the Germans were, especially in the Germany was. Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Germany during actually the problem with Germany was that it couldn't identify or determine its geopolitical identity, because it was divided between two trends: either to become a naval power, okay, or to become a land power. So under Bismarck had in mind to transform Germany into a naval power. That was the reason why he wanted to establish good relations in the East with the Russians on one hand and with the Austrians on the other hand. Okay, but later on with Wilhelm II, okay, there was an intermediate approach by the Germans, that they saw that it was too costly to become or to challenge the British in the open seas. And Wilhelm II thought that he could, let's say, benefit from an innovation back then, which is the railroads, okay, to draw an alliance with the Austrians and the Ottoman Empire and establish a railroad, let's say, network stretching from Berlin all the way to Baghdad in order to reach the Indian Ocean. Okay, and by this he thought that he could outmaneuver the British in the open seas, and at the same time the Russians, who were considered as the biggest and strongest land power. But he failed in his task after all. That was the reason for the defeat in this First World War. Then in the Second World War, we had two factions within the Nazi party. The Strasser faction, the Strasser brothers faction, which was considered as a leftist, let's say. They were concentrated mainly in the northern urban centers, industrialized centers, whereas Hitler faction actually was much influenced by its rural background. So the Strasser brothers wanted to challenge, or let's say that faction of the Nazi party wanted to challenge the British in the open seas, okay, and they thought that this should be that the Anglo-Saxon, let's say, hegemony in the world should be challenged, and Karl Haushofer reasoned in this way. So that was the reason why Karl Haushofer called for an alliance between the Soviet Union, Germany, and Japan in order to break this the hegemony of this Anglo-Saxon serpent that is controlling the world. Whereas Hitler wanted to appease the Anglo-Saxons and not to get in conflict with them and expand eastward, by the way. So, and one of the reasons that were pivotal in the war was the sinking of the two big ships of Germany, the Graf Spee in Brazil, in Uruguay, I think, or in Brazil, and the Bismarck. Okay, because this was the one of the factors that gave the upper hand for the ones who want to expand or who wanted to expand the empire, the Reich, by land in the east. Okay, and that was the reason for someone like Rudolf Hess to venture into the United Kingdom on his own, thinking that he had a peace initiative with the British. However, he was captured and kept in prison. Okay, so Hitler wanted desperately to get along with the Anglo-Saxons, the British, and even the Americans, but it was the British who refused this initiative. And despite all that, Hitler thought that he had secured his flank in the West in order to concentrate his efforts against the Soviet Union. He had in mind to reach the Urals and set them as the borders of Eastern Europe, but he miserably failed, mainly in Stalingrad.
Yes.
Because had he been able to capture Stalingrad, he would have been able to get to Central Asia, which is the weak belly of Russia, and then he would have been able to separate European Russia from Asian Russia. That was why the Soviets or the Russians mobilized all their efforts in order to block this attempt. And later on, I believe that the Stalingrad was very similar to Borodino battle against Napoleon, and whereas Kursk battle was similar to a major battle. The name is too complicated for me. It's in Russian.
You already
during in the fight against Napoleon.
Yeah. Doctor, those are amazing information that also gives us some perspective in what's happening nowadays. And one of the arguments that nowadays critics of U.S. foreign policy, let's say that the United States wants to also weaken Germany through the gate of Ukraine. And they say Germany had a great opportunity to increase its cooperation with Russia. The natural gas is coming from Russia, and the industries and the technologies from Germany. And these two powers together could have had a hegemony over the entire European continent. And Germany would have had an opportunity to grow as a major power, right, with Russia. So when we see this situation, I just have two questions, and I want to know now in 2024, why the United States wanted to weaken Germany, also by hitting the Nord Stream pipelines, and why Germany chose a secondary role under the United States, when it has the opportunity to become a major power in the world in cooperation with Russia.
First, one of the objectives of the United States through the war in Ukraine was to transform Ukraine into a military base in order to hit deep inside Russia and even divide Russia into several states. But there is also a secondary objective, which is to draw a wedge between Germany on one hand and Russia on the other hand. Because through this, Russia wouldn't be able to reach the Atlantic Ocean.
Mhm.
Okay, so it will remain a land power, and at the same time, Germany is the only power capable of leading an independent European role
Yes.
at international scene. So the Americans wanted to keep it at bay. First, by playing on European contradictions, this traditional French-German hostility on one hand, and too bad, Jacques Chirac, the
Mm.
former French president, in 2004, well, under de Villepin, uh, Russia or France tried to play an independent role. It was punished for its opposition to the American invasion of Iraq.
Mhm.
Okay, and then due to this punishment, Jacques Chirac chose willingly to become the bitch of George Bush. Okay, that was the deal between them in June 2004. And in return for playing the bitch of George Bush, he bluntly said it that instead of Britain, I'll be your ally in, let's say, checking the rise of Germany, because the French don't want, or let's say, a leading role by Germany in Europe. They would rather be second to the US rather than be second to Germany.
Mm.
Okay, and at the same time, the financial crisis that hit Spain and Greece was one of the reasons, was mainly American intervention in order to, let's say, create a financial crisis in the Mediterranean belt of Europe, and uh, force Germany to come to rescue these countries. Okay,
Mhm.
of course, the German formula wasn't that good for the Greeks or the Spanish, for example, but that was the main
Deal.
logic. And
Mhm.
later on, the Americans even encouraged the British to exit Europe, and then they established a triple alliance with them and with the Australians as part of their strategy to have outposts checking Eurasia from the west and from the east. Okay, from the west through UK and
Mhm.
from the east through Australia. And uh, so the Americans are worried of an independent German role. And this was based on an Anglo-Saxon precedent. So in the First World War, it was mainly Britain that led the Anglo-Saxons to check the rise of Germany as the leader of Europe, and this also happened in during the Second World War. Okay, this was the major reason, not the concentration camps of Adolf
Mm.
Hitler or the racism of the Nazi Party. These are all, let's say, moral tools to justify certain geopolitical trends and policies.
Doctor, I know I'm jumping from one topic to another, but since you live in Lebanon, and this is going to be my last question to you, Israeli side is setting some deadlines now to invade Lebanon, and they're threatening Hezbollah with the war. Do you agree with the notion that if Israel invades Lebanon, this is going to be a grave strategic miscalculation from the Israeli side that could lead into Hezbollah ground offensive against northern Galil and the crumbling of the inner, let's say, front inside of Israel. I'm not saying Israel will going to lose the conflict, but they're going to face a major blow, which could bring the United States into this conflict.
Well, the Israelis have already received a severe blow. Not only them, but also the American geopolitical agenda for the region. Because if we go back to the G20 summit held during the summer 2023, the Americans launched an initiative, the Indian, Middle Eastern, European corridor. And this is not, let's say, economic corridor, but it's rather a geopolitical one, because it establishes an integral relationship between Western Europe, which is under US hegemony, and India, which is ruled by a fanatic Hindu nationalist party that is hostile to Muslims, and a time when India is trying to play a role and compete over influence with China in Southern Asia. Okay? But this, the major link between the two sides would be Israel and the port of Haifa. And this poses questions about the reasons for the destruction of the port of Beirut. And who did that? Okay, noting that the FBI were the first to be on ground to investigate what happened, and until now they never gave us any result of the evidence they collected. And it was also, let's say, curious to note that all satellites went off during the 10 minutes that preceded and came right after the explosion. The French, for example, promised our former president of Republic to provide him with satellite images in order to see what really happened. Until now, they are still processing the pictures,
pixelizing them.
Yeah. Anyways, maybe they saw someone naked somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Israel would play the major role. Okay, and let me elaborate on this point. Okay.
Yes.
And the regional partners are Arab countries that never had a leading role, a leading independent role in the Arab Islamic history. It's Jordan, Saudi Arabia, which only played a leading role in contemporary or in recent times due to American support, and the UAE, which was until recently part, or let's say it was considered as part of Oman, occupied by the British. Okay, the Oman Empire or Oman Sultanate. Okay.
Yes.
So why would the Americans establish this partnership between Israel and marginal powers in the Middle East, rather than with Egypt, which is pro-American, Turkey, which is a member of NATO, okay, or of course Iran is considered as hostile to the Americans, but also Iraq, which is under American occupation, and Syria, which is partially under American occupation, because the Americans don't want to give a leading role in the region for any power that has its own potentials.
Yes.
Because it might rebel against American hegemony and control. Okay? So, in order for Israel to be the pillar of this regional order, a pillar should be solid. Okay?
Yeah.
So, Israel shouldn't be divided. A pillar shouldn't be geographically divided.
Yes.
So there is no place for a Palestinian state.
Mm-hmm.
And a pillar shouldn't also be divided nationally
Yes.
between Zionists and Palestinians. So it was a matter of time for the Israelis to launch an aggression against the Palestinians in order to force them out of Gaza into Sinai, and this is an old plan. Then they would turn their attention to the West Bank and force the Palestinians out to Jordan before, and also for a pillar to be solid, it shouldn't be threatened by resistance groups. So Hamas and other resistance groups should be wiped out from Gaza. Then the Israelis would turn their attention eventually against Hezbollah.
Yes.
Some information, it seems, got leaked to the Palestinians. And that was the reason why they launched a preemptive strike, because they, let's say, there is this festivity or celebration, Jewish celebration.
Yes, it's the Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur. Yes.
Yeah. So the celebrations were meant to end on the eve of October 7th. And the information that was leaked by some agents to the resistance was that thereafter, in the following week, Israel would launch its strike against Gaza. So that's why the resistance launched a preemptive strike in order to abort the plan. They were successful in their task. This is what happened actually in Gaza. Okay, and that was the reason why the Islamic resistance in Lebanon directly intervened, because they knew that they would come next.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and had the Israelis, okay, sorry for this long answer,
No worries.
but this is to come to your point. Based on our experience with the Zionists, whenever they had a military plan in mind, they would create a justification or a pretext. Okay, so they don't wait for a pretext to launch their attack. For example, in 1982, the frontier was very quiet, but they used an assassination attempt against the Israeli ambassador in London as a pretext for their invasion, because the plan was set. Now, had the Israelis been able to launch their attack on Lebanon with guaranteed results, they would have done it no matter what would be the pretext. Okay? But to conclude my answer, the Israelis are not capable of achieving tangible results. They can cause big damage. They can destroy the country the way they did to Gaza. But at the same time, they would be, this time, fighting in northern Palestine, trying to defend the colonies they established illegally in the past century. And this would be a very huge damage to the sense of national security of the Zionists that would cripple this entity and lead it to disappear. Because despite the, let's say, limited attack by the by the Palestinian factions against Israel, since the beginning of this Al-Aqsa flood, or Tufan Al-Aqsa, okay?
Yes.
We had hundreds of thousands of Zionists leaving Palestine back to Ukraine and to other European countries, okay? Because it turned out that Israel, quote unquote, is not a safe haven for them, and it would never be.
I think that's the one of the concepts of Israel is that it's a safe haven for the Jewish people, and I think what Hezbollah has done from southern Lebanon against the northern settlements, it has destroyed this concept that it's a safe haven. And I think Israel cannot sustain as a state if it's not safe haven for the Jewish people. Therefore, it is already a big strategic blow to the Israeli, the
Definitely.
concept of the state, And as you mentioned, I also think that if they were able to invade Lebanon, they would have done that. I mean, they have now thousands of excuses because of the rocket attacks, missile attacks, ATGMs, and drone attacks against the settlements and against the Israeli occupation installations. So they would have done that if they were able. Americans are telling them also not to do it because the repercussions are going to be huge, also on American assets in the region.
By the way, sorry, in case the Israelis expand the war, it would become a regional war, which is
Yes.
It is already a regional war, but under a certain ceiling. In case they expand the scope of this war, I believe that it would speed up the process of shifting from a unipolar system into a multipolar system, and this will be a severe blow. Hello?
Yes, I can
This
hear
would
you
be
well.
a severe blow to the Americans.
Yeah, I also
this
think
would be
that
a severe blow to the American empire and hegemony all over the world.
Exactly. Dr. Jamal Wakim, it was really great having you on my channel today to get the historical perspective of the Ukraine war and also the current hostilities in southern Lebanon against Israel. I think we already missed him from this. Guys, I truly apologize for today's inconveniences in terms of the Dr. Jamal Wakim's let's see. Yeah, Dr. Jamal Wakim's internet was not the best. And tomorrow, by the way, on Friday at 5 p.m. Central European time, I think it's now 12 at Eastern American time, we are going to discuss the 15th anniversary of the Syrian war, which the Syrian opposition called it a revolution against Assad. So me and most probably Hekmat Abu Khater is going to join me. He is also a Syrian journalist working for the Grey Zone. And we're going to discuss the 15-year anniversary because the opposition is celebrating it again in Washington, D.C. And we have to shed light on some of the root causes of the conflict and also where are we at the current moment in this conflict. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe and also activate the bell. And tomorrow we will see each other at 5. Please accept my apologies in terms of the technical problems that we faced today, something that is out of my hands. I was trying to fix it for 15 minutes before this live streaming, before Dr. Jamal Wakim and I been live. But there are things that definitely, like I live here in privilege in Germany. I have a good connection. I have everything in my hands, but some people do not have that privilege, unfortunately, in other parts of the world. Therefore, I tried to continue and present whatever we have in our hands, right? So we will see you tomorrow, guys. Peace be upon you and upon your families. Salam.